Should I learn French with a teacher from France? That's going to be the topic of the video today. But before we start, a few things I'd like to express before we start. Well, the first is thank you very much for watching and for leaving comments and giving of your time, your precious time to watch these videos and to comment, it was always my purpose ever since I started to use social media, Instagram or YouTube, to hope to meet people, to exchange real opinions in the real world through social media and not have a one-sided exchange. Well, it's sort of an oxymoron, isn't it? A one-sided exchange, but a one-sided one-sided transfer of points of view. And in this I feel that you've made these videos successful, as I see it, because people have been reacting. I've seen some very interesting points of view. Just anyone who drops a comment, in the parlance of today, dropping a comment, it just makes me happy to see it. I find it, yeah, just makes it successful. It's not the views, it's really it's the substance, and I think the comments bring substance to the videos, for which I thank you. The second thing I wanted to mention is, well, it just makes me happy that long-form content still works, because I hear the idea floating around that people have less and less abilities to focus because of the effect of text messaging, instant gratification, this whole internet culture, quick videos, reels that we see on Facebook, and I see that there's still room for long-form content. And when I did my first long-form content video on this channel, I really didn't know what I was getting into. I just said, I'm going to throw it out there, I'm going to be myself, I'm going to speak at the pace I speak at, it's going to be slow, it's going to have an adult-like tone. I wanted to replicate something I say in real life, and I saw that I am seeing that it works. So I'm happy about that, and people do not have the attention span of a goldfish, as I sometimes see. So thanks for that. That's good news also. I appreciate that. And so today obviously we'll be speaking about, should I learn French with a teacher from France? I expect to ruffle a few feathers, of course. Of course I'm biased, but I'm not completely right, I'm not completely wrong, and I'm maybe partially right and partially wrong. So it's somewhere in between. And I think it's important in today's world to be able to disagree and have a conversation and say, well, Chris, I don't think you're completely right, or I think you are completely right, and this is my point of view and this is yours. So I'm not imposing my point of view, but this is just how I see French teaching. So I do expect to ruffle a few feathers. Et pour les Français, évidemment, mais je n'ai pas de... Bon, ceci est un point de vue, hein. Donc j'ai l'impression de bien connaître la France, que je connais depuis plus de 40 ans. J'ai l'impression de bien connaître comment le français s'enseigne, comment l'anglais s'enseigne dans les lycées, dans les collèges. J'ai l'impression d'assez bien connaître l'état d'esprit de la France, les cours FLE. Alors on peut ne pas être d'accord, on peut dire, ben non Chris, je crois que tu te trompes, c'est beaucoup mieux que ce que tu penses, ou au contraire tu as raison, et voilà, on n'est pas d'accord sur tout, mais c'est un échange de points de vue, et évidemment, voilà, je suis, comme on dit, biaisé, hein, c'est pas tout à fait objectif évidemment, parce que moi je ne donne pas de cours typiques FLE. Donc voilà, échangeons des points de vue, et voilà, c'est pas de la provoque gratuite, évidemment, non. Hein. So anyway, let's start, and the question is, should I learn French with a teacher from France? Of course, the choice of words, should, well, it's not objective, is it? I am biased. Let's start. Right. Don't want to slam it closed. When learning a language, it's natural to want to get closest to the country which we feel is most associated with that target language. If the target language was German, it's probable that Germany would take first place over Austria, and if it was Spanish, we would likely choose Spain over Argentina and Peru. In the case of French, I think, it's an opinion, I think that repeated imagery of the blue, white and red and the Eiffel Tower will have most learners designate France as the most trustworthy source of learning. Every year students invest time and resources to stay in France at month-long language camps, just as others book stays in the UK to hope to learn the quote-unquote real English accent. Although it would be unreasonable to dismiss a love of a certain French culture as a motivational factor in the act of learning French, it would be unreasonable to dismiss this. It's my opinion that such strategies are simplistic and don't take into account the full picture. Not only do they oversimplify, but they blatantly ignore an elephant so big that the room leaves barely any room to stand. Namely, that France is a monolingual country and one of the most monolingual countries you will ever see. But does it matter? Does it matter that France only speaks French? I write these lines initially, now I'm speaking these words, but I wrote these lines as a linguist and as a person who is multicultural and multilingual. And I do indeed believe that it matters quite a lot. I also write as one who knows France as an insider in matters of tradition, social life and school. In terms of the quality of the learning you will receive from a strictly French, quote-unquote, strictly French teacher, it would be unreasonable to affirm any absolute truths. You can't say once and for all, this is what you get from a typical French teacher, of course not. This being said, I think there are questions worth asking that surround the upbringing and frame of mind of such teachers or language schools, by extension. The first question is whether there's any logical contradiction in asking for plurality from a teacher who was raised in singularity. Plurality versus singularity. Is there any logical contradiction? In other words, is there something to scrutinize when asking a teacher from a country that only has one language how to become a speaker of several? Of the 4 French-speaking countries of Europe, you may know that only France has one language. It implies that the average French citizen is not brought up in a multicultural frame of mind, contrary to the Belgians, the Luxembourgers and the Swiss, who all share their living space with speakers of German, Dutch and English. 3 countries prepare their citizens to accept multilingualism as normal. One does not. And it all started with the following document, which is going to come up on the screen, a royal decree from 1539 that guarantees French as the only language of the nation. The Ordonnance de Villers-Cotterêts was signed by the King of France in 1539 that made French the official and only language of the country. And this law is still in the French Constitution today, unless I am mistaken. Please do correct me. Corrigez-moi les Français si je me trompe, mais je ne pense pas que je me trompe. I don't think I am wrong. Let's talk about how French-speaking Europeans grow up. Young speakers of French from Belgium, Luxembourg and Switzerland are introduced to foreign languages in school, but also in the public sphere. Shops, street signs and government services operate in a minimum of 2 languages. School children from Luxembourg grow up with the understanding that they will learn German, French and Luxembourgish as official languages. They'll also learn English as an extra foreign language. That's the situation in Luxembourg. In Belgium we see a very similar situation where citizens are aware that for a majority of office jobs French and Dutch are compulsory. If you want to get an office job anywhere, you need to know French and Dutch, at a minimum, with English considered a prerequisite to having one's resume even considered. So you send in your resume to any employer in Belgium, if it doesn't say English, I don't think you would be considered even. That's how important it is. So we could make the blanket statement that any entry-level job, in Brussels at least, requires Dutch and French, while employment in just one language is seen as an oddity. Now, of course, there are jobs that you can do with just one language in Brussels. You probably don't need to, I don't know, just a random example, you probably don't need to speak 2 languages or 3 languages to sell bicycles, or, I don't know, to open a bakery, but I think it would be seen as an oddity. The key notion here that I'm getting at is normality. The entire life experience of citizens of the 3 aforementioned countries, Belgium, Luxembourg and Switzerland, these 3 francophone countries of Europe, is embedded in a plurality of languages and culture. Different cultures, different languages. It is their normal. As the odd one out, there's France, a country where monolingualism is not only expected, but enforced. As per the Royal Ordinance of 1539, on the territory of France, no other language shall be used but French. There isn't so much as a half step to give a special status to Italian or Spanish in certain departments in the way the US accommodates speakers of Spanish. It's French all the way. Now, though English is taught to French school children, it remains a foreign language. And it's a skill that finds no useful application in France. More often than not, English is rather seen by employers as a proof of education, rather than a crucial asset. Needless to say, English finds no representation in the public sphere, with the exception perhaps of airports and tourist centres, and that is just a massive thing I discovered in the US, because you know the reputation of the United States, you know, it's English, they can't learn foreign languages. There is more French in the public sphere, and Spanish, of course, in the USA than I have ever seen English in France. That's quite something to consider. You will go to the supermarkets in America, buy products, it will say something in French very often. You might buy, I don't know, an electric kettle, it will say something in French on the box. French is visible in the public sphere. Not in France. Apart from airports and tourist centres, I really don't think there's much English in the public sphere. So let's now talk about compared life experiences. In terms of their personal experience learning foreign languages, the average French citizen could not hope to compete with citizens of the 3 other francophone countries, in my opinion. This is factual, I believe, in the number of years they study languages, the number of languages they learn, and the practical use they have for them in everyday life. Is there even any competition between France and the other 3 countries of Europe that speak French? I'm not counting Monaco. I'm aware that Monaco exists, but to make things simple, in France, back to France, in France the English language is not seen or heard in films, on television, or even on the radio. Well, partially. But on the radio there are official state regulations that impose a quota of French-speaking songs. English is seen as a menace to the purity of the French language, and any act of borrowing from English just as soon disdainfully called anglicisme. Now, an anglicisme is the worst thing you could ever do to the purity of the French language. There is the term anglicisme. We don't have that in English. We don't say, oh, it's a francicisme, oh, a French language, oh, blending into our beautiful English language. It's just a different frame of mind, I believe. A student, such as yourself maybe, who misunderstands the art of teaching foreign languages might rationalise that as long as the French teacher speaks it as a native, little more is required, so long as they are FLE qualified. Teacher of French as a foreign language, FLE. Now, such an argument, in my view, would work if it were also true that all great athletes automatically qualify as great sport coaches, under the pretext that they can do the sport themselves. You see where I'm going with this? And I don't want to argue with an absurd argument, but in a sense, at least partially, I think it is true. It's not because you're good at French and you speak it as a native and you have a certificate that qualifies you as an FLE teacher that automatically makes you good at it. Does it? I don't know. Tell me in the comments. Let's talk now about the matter of the French accent. A myth that dies a very hard death is the French accent, which students hope will rub off on them, and that justifies the travel to France. Quite unfortunately, there are few chances of this ever happening, and for several reasons. Well, firstly, there's not one French uniform accent for the whole country of France. There are many minute variations according to the age and locality of the speaker, of course. Because of increased mobility, second argument, it's become an uncertain bet to target Paris as a guarantee to encounter Parisian-born teachers. It's not because you go to Paris that you'll see genuine Parisian-born teachers. Other eroding factors in the matter of noticeable accents include media and simply personal choice. Two people born in Marseille, in the south of France, might develop two different accents for these reasons. And I'm actually teaching a French pupil from Marseille at this very moment. He's in senior year. He's doing his l'année du bac, right? He's in senior year. He must be about 16. It's not quite the année du bac, just before. And I said, "Oh, you're from Marseille, are you? Why don't you have the accent?" And then he sort of went, "Ah, si tu veux, je prends l'accent de Marseille." And he started to speak in typical Marseillais, which is quite amusing. But I've met several people from Marseille. The geographical position, or origin of the person doesn't guarantee a French accent anymore. Of course not. Some people in the Midi have the accent, you know, l'accent du Midi. Some people don't. Just the way things work these days. Second, or rather third here, imitating an accent is a different skill than taking a French language class, and has more to do with accent reduction and phonetics. So these are two different things. Taking a French class and imitating an accent are two different skills. Practically, it means hours of targeted work with a specialized teacher who would correct and readjust the slightest phoneme pronounced in French. It far surpasses the fact of saying "ah" with a non-English French accent, and rather aims to match the exact way the teacher speaks. That's a different skill altogether. So your teacher might have a certain French accent from a certain area. If you were to learn how to replicate this accent, it's a completely different skill than learning to speak French. In other words, I believe it also shows that it's not that valuable to have a French teacher who's from a certain area rather than another. Also, I've mentioned this in other videos, French is French, regardless of the area, regardless of location. Now, with the exception of Canada, of course, Quebec, the variations between each country's accents would not be discernible to a student. It's like when I hear German, I can't say if you're from Munich or from somewhere else, or from Berlin, I don't have that ear. So I don't believe a student would even discern the different French accents. I've spoken to Belgians, French, Swiss and Luxembourgers who all offered me a perfectly understandable rendition of French. The slight differences in accents were at best negligible. And lastly, the question of accents takes a more subtle understanding than the one usually accessible by the general public. So what does this mean? When seen through the scope of linguistics, let's speak about linguistics, an accent can affect several variables in different measures. So there's the risk of using the umbrella term accent. We must understand what we mean by accent. An accent is not an overall influence that taints the whole language when a person speaks. An accent can be one single letter that speakers say in a certain way. For example, doing a slightly longer "a" in certain words. It could also be an intonation that's used in certain types of questions. Accents are not always as intense as a Scottish accent in opposition to an English accent. So I think we must be aware of this. It's not an overall influence that taints the whole language, and you can call this, you can break down accents. They are accents influence the way we speak sometimes in minute parts. Let's talk about English for a second. Between the higher up north you go in the UK, you could make the argument that the accent becomes harder or rougher. Like it's more. I have more of a south of England type of accent. I think a big point of division within all people who speak English in the UK is the way they say R. I personally say France. A lot of people say France with a short A. And the other one is the way you say your I. The sound E. Like you could have three renditions of this. I say coffee, E, coffee, but some people say coffee. Would you like some coffee? Like, what a lovely baby. Oh, what a lovely baby. Like the Queen would say a baby with a short E. So she wouldn't do a long E, a longish E, coffee. She would say coffee. One would like a cup of coffee. Anyway, different accents. So this, you could call that an accent. You could say, oh, you say a short A, you say a long A. So it's more than just, you could be, what I'm trying to say, you could be divided by just two sounds. The way you say E and the way you say R, or not say R. And the third one is also, I forgot, it's the O. Like I say colour, my cousins say colour, the colour of the fence. I say the colour of the fence, colour. I say rough, you say rough, it's a bit rough. But we're essentially divided by those two or three sounds, because the example with the posh coffee, it's a bit extreme maybe, but certainly the A and the O, it's rough. France is, I don't know, France is lovely. Okay, I say France is lovely, they would say France is lovely. Okay, so sometimes an accent comes down to these small sounds, individual sounds. Let's now talk about the French vocabulary and grammar of France. Students who are worried about not using the proper French words, quote unquote, the proper French words, should not be. Again, there's no vocabulary from France versus the vocabulary of other French-speaking countries, and I have here two newspapers that show, I have the Belgian newspaper called Le Soir from 1887, and then next to that I'm comparing Le Monde from 1945. There's not a single difference in vocabulary. You have a Belgian newspaper, a French newspaper, there's no difference. There's no difference. As a child growing up in Belgium, we switched from French TV channels to Belgian without ever noticing the difference. It's quite remarkable. It was 100% clear understanding from us without even rationalising, oh hey, we're watching French TV now. To us it was just the French language. You're in Belgium, you have, I think there are, it's been a while now, but I think there were like 2 or 3 TV channels. You'd switch to TF1 to A2 to FR3, depending on the programmes. If France had a better cartoon on or a better TV series, sitcom, you'd watch the French one, and then sometimes you switch over to the Belgian one, and in our case we also watched a lot of BBC. But we never rationalised, oh, let's switch to the French frequency, or just French. It's all the same. Now, this is not to say that there aren't certain nouns that certain French people use in certain regions, certain words to describe things, of course, but it remains marginal. We have the same thing in English when naming insects. Some say woodlice, some say carpenter, and some say pillbug. We have that for several insects, different types of spiders. I personally say woodlice, that little grey insect. Little grey insect that you often find in wood, actually, rotten wood. In cold and damp places, other people apparently call it a carpenter or a pillbug. So you can be divided by different names for different things, but I think it remains marginal. I don't think it's a fact. Now next I'd like to speak about the importance of being multilingual as a teacher, because I think it is important. Do you remember the story of Heidi? the little barefooted Swiss girl who was sent to a posh family in the city for her education. It's the best known Swiss novel. If you remember, you'll know that the shock was tough on poor little Heidi. Her adoptive family had never seen quite such a savage as her. They'd never seen quite such a savage as her, and couldn't ever place themselves in Heidi's shoes. So it was a clash of two worlds. They could only teach Heidi what they knew. So little barefooted Heidi came from the Swiss mountains, it must have been in the 1800s, went to a posh city in, I believe it was in Switzerland, and they had never seen anything like it. Their job was to educate Heidi, but they didn't know the first thing about Heidi's world, because at the time she lived with her grandfather in the mountains. This family, this is an allegory of course, they couldn't say, okay Heidi, I know how you did this, and this is how you do things in the Swiss mountains, but this is the way we do things over here, and these are the reasons for it. Do we not think that it would have spared Heidi a few tears and a few unnecessary pains? Would she not have learnt the ways of the city easier if they had known where she came from? And this is of course the whole point in my French classes. Well, this is exactly what a French teacher from France does. In my view, and we can disagree, they've not the slightest clue of your English-speaking brain. They don't know how your English-speaking brain works, how you process language, or how you feel about French. How could they know? Because they are culturally and factually monolingual. And even if they can speak some English, they don't have that multicultural frame of mind. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, please do. Your French teacher from France will likely specialize in a transfer of information from them to you. It will be a one-sided transfer of knowledge, and it will be rather more slow than if you were shown the shortcuts from a French teacher who is also a native speaker of English, and I believe this to be very true. And lastly, I like to speak about the argument of tradition. For better or for worse, France is a very traditional country. I always say that you can leave France, come back 20 years later and still know all the songs on the radio, the presenters on TV, as if you had never left. It has a certain Groundhog Day quality to it that some find charming, that many find charming, and I do too when I'm there on holiday. Even 20 years from now, you'll still have French TV games singing songs of past glories, Claude François and Christophe. How does that go? Je lui dirai les mots bleus, les mots qu'on dit avec les yeux, and so forth. Alexandrie, Alexandra, they'll still be singing those songs 20 years from now, believe me. A bit as if the English were still singing the Beatles every week on TV. It doesn't make France silly in any way, not at all, but it's just a cultural trait of that particular country. And I put a picture of Jean-Pierre Foucault, which I'm sure the French viewers will know. You can switch off your TV, come back 30 years later and still see Jean-Pierre Foucault on TV, or Arthur, or Pierre Ardisson, any of them. There's a certain static quality of France, like Groundhog Day, that's specific to that country. Now, just today, the day I wrote that, one of my students told me that Marine Le Pen, politician Marine Le Pen, was ahead in the polls in the presidential elections in France. And I answered, yeah, she does that at every election. There's no surprise. It's not necessary to actively follow French politics to understand the landscape, and I really do believe that. I follow French politics from a distance. I sort of look at the situation every 6 months, every year even. I still understand what's going on. There's no massive surprises. Now, where this affects you as a learner is that it also touches upon the FLE teaching. A French teacher growing up and learning within a certain tradition, will teach French in a certain traditionalist way. Now, whether their method is right or wrong is not the issue to me, but it will simply be very hard for them to extract themselves from that tradition and approach you as a speaker of English. Remember, these teachers were made in a certain French tradition. And I think it will be very hard for them to extract themselves from this tradition. And I think that the result of this teaching will likely be a one-sided transfer of information from them to you and heavily embedded in tradition. That's what I believe. Yes, counter-argument, but you only say that because you know English and you're trying to flog the goods, Chris. You're not being honest. Now, my purpose in writing this article is not to go up against the whole of France because it would be ridiculous. On ne part pas en guerre contre la France, c'est pas du tout ça. There'll always be millions of students each year who continue to study in France and hoping that the points listed above do happen. Accent, vocabulary, quality of learning. Now, fighting this would be like trying to catch the cloud. It's ridiculous. It's fighting windmills. Hein? C'est les moulins. C'est Don Quixote. Hein? It's Don Quixote, of course. Hein? It would be ridiculous. So I'm not on a crusade against France or FLE teaching. On ne part pas en guerre. C'est pas les croisades contre la France, évidemment. Hein? Now, as a teacher, I myself define myself as an explainer of the French language to speakers of English. That's what I do. I explain French to speakers of English. It's a vehicle for communication, French language. It's a vehicle for communication that does not belong to one country. It's a tool for communication. So I make it my job to say, okay, this is how we do things in English, and this is how French works. That's my job. Now I can do this, of course, and I've said it a few times, because I know the logic of both English and French as a native, and also on a technical side. The language, French, is not a country. It's a language, and that's what I teach. So I'm not in favour of one country against another. I'm looking at the language, the vehicle for communication that we call French. It's a system of communication. That's what I do. Now, all this being said, I do find France a beautiful country. I always will, which I gladly visit at every chance. I will show it to my wife with great pride. And I think we'll be doing that next summer, the day we take a trip there. And I hope to show her my favourite cities and towns of France, of which Auxerre, Troyes, Toul, Dijon, Albi, Bourges, and many others. It's absolutely, I love the east of France. It's an absolutely beautiful country. But only I will be teaching her French, no one else. Thanks for watching. Okay, that was the end of my article, and thank you if you've watched so far. It's I'll say one thing before I log off. It's really funny, you know, when I say that France has this sort of groundhog quality, it's something I love to see, but what I'm arguing here is in favour of, I'm defending the point of view that it does have an influence on the teaching. I taught English to French pupils from two of the most famous distance learning schools. I don't see any reason not to name them, but one is called Atemer and the other is called Legendre. I used to teach these pupils. The way they learn English in France, I don't think there's been much progress from 2 years ago than the 1960s. They were saying it's an analytical study of English. None of them, well, it's a bit easy to say, make a blanket statement, but I didn't see a pupil of these kids I used to teach face-to-face that had a reasonable grasp of English, you know, could use it as a tool to converse, but what they were doing is studying English on an analytical level. I remember they were using terms even I didn't understand. So it was like la complémente de la propositionnelle, de l'enchâssé and all that, la subordonnée. I was like, what are you on about? And I just had to take a second and say, wait, say that again. So the complement of the the secondary subordinate proposition. I said, wait, what? What are we doing here? It was quite technical, and it was. I still have actually in my hard drive here the learning material from those schools. I still have it, and well, obviously I wouldn't put it up on the internet because it's private property. It's their own intellectual property, but it's terribly outdated. And I think France is a country of tradition, and of course, it bleeds into the way they teach languages. France, I think, is a monolingual country, and for my part, I think there is a strong contradiction in learning plurality from someone who was raised in singularity. You will never... France encourages French, that's all, and I don't want to get political, but we are seeing a lot of problems in France in their I know there are many reasons for this, but in the difficulty that they're finding to deal with the whole question of religion and plurality of religion, as opposed to one state, one language, no religion. You know, they find it very hard. You know, the whole debate around the headscarves and everything, l'état laïque français, and they find it hard to accommodate plurality. So, and I'll finish on a little anecdote to, in a sense, I think France is adorable, because when I go to France with my wife, I will say, look at that, typical French, you know, polo Lacoste, smoking a cigarette, waiting for the little cafe, you know. I say, oh, you come back in 20 years, in 60 years, you'll still see a guy in a little polo Lacoste having a cigarette, waiting for his coffee. It's just one of those things. And when I was last in France, I think my last visit to France was, I took a holiday near Narbonne in the south of France, and I swear the first thing, I stepped onto a bus straight out of the airport. Stepped onto a bus. What did I hear on the radio? En rouge et noir, je tenais ma peur, j'irai plus haut. That song, En rouge et noir. I don't know who sings it. Could it be? No, it's not Patricia Cass. I don't know who sings En rouge et noir. It's a song that used to be fashionable in the 80s. It used to be a hit song in the 80s, and during the bus ride, I recognised just about every song. I think some things don't change. And in the Airbnb, there was a TV, and I knew quite a good chunk of the presenters. And there was I think, was it called l'île Koh-Lanta? So near La Rochelle in France, there's an island on which with the, you know, it's, what's it called? L'île or something, l'île or, and it's sort of an island where you have these physical challenges. It's on an island, it's in a castle. I think that there's tigers sometimes, and I'm thinking, Fort Boyard, I think it was Fort Boyard. I'm thinking, are they still doing Fort Boyard? I last switched off television when I was 19. I was still living in Belgium at the time. When I was 19, I sort of took the statement of, I'm not watching TV anymore, it's not for me. You can... How many years is that? I'm not going to say, but you come back to, you still recognise the same programmes. I don't know, Arthur, Ardisson, I don't know, could it be Jean-Pierre, yeah, of course, Jean-Pierre Foucault, Michel, what's the other one? Michel looks a lot like, anyway, so that's France for you. And of course, everyone has entire liberty, it's their own personal choice to study French with who they want. This is just my view on the matter. Feel free to agree or to disagree. Tell me how much you disagree with me or how much you agree. In any case, I'm hoping to get a little conversation going. Thank you very much for your time. This is quite a long video. I'm Chris from We Communicate. Merci beaucoup. Bye. See you next time.